When I was young, the right drilled into me a worldview that cast existence as a mythic battlefield. You weren't just living life. You were a soldier of God in a shadow war between good and evil, civilization and satanic collapse. Every book, every sermon, every online forum I haunted hammered this into me. And when you absorb that frame at 13, 14 years old, you don't just play soldier. You begin to think like one. You map your life to war. You see enemies where others see neighbors. You study strategy not as an abstraction, but as survival. That was my indoctrination, but the critical turn is when my end-timer worldview collapsed, when revelation turned to rubble in my hands. I didn't lose the strategic imprint, the mythic sense of self, the sense of the world as a battlefield of forces larger than any one of us. That stayed. What changed was the target. What changed was the philosophy. The same discipline, the same asymmetric instinct, the same taste for strategy that could have left me a militia fantasist. I redirected it toward enlightenment. The irony is that the right's indoctrination gave me the very tools that would one day allow me to oppose them. They weaponized myth, and I learned from that because what they understand, and what most liberals frankly never have, is that strategy isn't only fought on the battlefield. It is fought in narrative. It is fought in symbols. It is fought in myth. The modern right excels at asymmetric warfare, not militarily, but mimetically. They know that control of reality isn't about bullets, it's about belief. They manufacture shadow wars that don't exist, then conscript ordinary people into them. They wrap their movement in a story where every act, every outrage, every grievance feels like part of a grand cosmic battle. And once you believe you're in that story, you'll follow it anywhere. That is the field of battle, narrative terrain, and it's a battlefield the left has consistently ceded. Too many think that fact-checking is enough, that truth will speak for itself. But truth doesn't march without armor. It doesn't win without a banner. The right dresses its lies in mythic cloth, and facts alone can't pierce that without a countermyth. One rooted in reality, one disciplined enough to outlast their spectacle. This is why I coined the term Endarkenment. I took it directly from Curtis Yarvin's Dark Enlightenment, but inverted it, because the duality matters. They mythologize darkness as depth, reaction as wisdom, regression as inevitability. I flipped it. I framed them not as the bearers of forbidden knowledge, but as what they are, in an anti-enlightenment cult. And I set enlightenment versus endarkenment as the true civilizational struggle. That is myth used not to delude, but to clarify. A factual countermyth, mapping onto reality while speaking in the same mythic register that ordinary people intuitively understand. This is asymmetric strategy in practice. They build castles out of paranoia. You don't batter those walls head on with rationalism alone. You make their castles transparent. You recast the myth itself so the fortress becomes a prison in plain sight. You use the same asymmetric principles I learned as a teenager studying Sun Tzu and Clausewitz. You never attack an enemy where they are strong. You never march into their prepared terrain. You shift the battlefield. You choose the ground. And in narrative warfare, the ground is meaning itself. The right thrives because they make every political dispute feel like Armageddon. Mask mandates weren't public health measures, they were tyranny. Climate change wasn't science, it was globalist conspiracy. Each issue folded seamlessly into the myth of a shadow war. And when you live in that myth, no fact can reach you. That's why their hold feels unshakable. It isn't about policies. It's about cosmology. So, the counter must also be cosmological. not in the sense of fantasy, but in the sense of grounding. We have to make liberty itself mythic again, not as a slogan, but as a lived reality. Housing not as a program, but as sovereignty. Time not as wages, but as liberation. Systems designed so that freedom is the default output. This is what I mean when I say enlightenment versus endarkenment. It isn't an academic debate. It's narrative terrain, staked and contested. If they are the cult of regression, then we must be the architects of becoming. The fundamentals of asymmetric war apply here with absolute clarity. The weaker side doesn't mimic the strong. It redefines the battlefield. When you cannot match their resources, you undermine their legitimacy. When you cannot overpower their spectacle, you outlast it with substance. When they marshal their followers into paranoia, you offer liberation that speaks not only to reason, but to the human hunger for story. Because the truth is that people crave myth. It isn't weakness, it's human. My mistake as a boy was confusing myth with truth. My victory as a man has been learning that myth and truth can be fused, that you can tell a story that is factual, grounded, and still speaks to the heart. That's the real art of asymmetric war, to take what they use as a weapon of delusion and reforge it as a tool of emancipation. Every authoritarian in history has known the power of myth. Every resistance that won understood it better. We are in that same struggle. And until the left learns to take the field back on narrative terrain, to weave enlightenment into the mythic register of our time, the right will continue to recruit armies in the shadows. This is why strategy matters, not as an intellectual game, but as the line between liberty and subjugation. The mythic sense I was given in indoctrination is the very reason I can see it. And it's why I know that the only way to win this war is not to deny myth, but to master it. Not to retreat into dry rationalism, but to build a counter-myth worthy of reality. The Enlightenment has always been that story, the only story strong enough to outlast the Endarkenment. A story of liberty, of dignity, of reason, of solidarity. A story that maps to reality and builds a future where freedom is not promised, but permanent. That is the story we must tell. That is the battlefield we must win. And in asymmetric war, the battlefield is everything. Whoever shapes the terrain decides the outcome.